Well, good morning. Good morning. All right. The joy
of the Lord
is my strength. The joy is my strength. Now you guys say it. The joy, and then the joy of the Lord. Oh, a little more volume. Let's try one more time. The joy is my strength. All right, we're getting there. How many of you guys are ready to find out what happened to Ceedie? Can anybody, some of you guys weren't here last week. Is anybody not here last week? Or not remember or not know anything about the story? Okay, so let's fill them in, the ones that were not here. Who is Ceedie? Can somebody tell me who Ceedie is and anything about him, some highlights from last time? A seed, okay. Do you have something on Ceedie? That doesn't know what he is. A bunch of other seeds were buried and got sold. And who was the owner of Ceedie? Does anybody remember her name? Mrs. Jenny, as actually Jenkins, but yeah, it's close. Grandma J, they called her. Grandma Jenkins owned a seed shop, a nursery, and what happened? Where did we last leave Ceedie? What happened to Ceedie at the end of last time's story? In the dirt. Which way in the dirt? I don't think I said this last time, but one important detail, Ceedie was face down. He was face down in the dirt. Sandra, you want to come up here a little bit? Can you come up here? When you're face down, imagine, here, I'll get you. When you're face down, and let's say Sandra comes running to me because maybe she's scared or something, and I hold out my coat like this, and she puts her face right in there. She can't see anything, right? Can she see anything? Can she see what's going on? Is it dark? Is she cared about? Does somebody care about her? Yeah, I care about her, but she can't see that, right? She can't feel that. Go ahead, Sandra. You can sit back down. Thank you. Well, I want to tell you about little Ceedie. And I don't have Ceedie up here anymore because in today's story, Ceedie is no longer Ceedie. And I told you I have two parts to the story. Part one was lost, alone, and forsaken. That's where we left Ceedie. Today's story is called But, Limitless Fruit and Stars of Beauty. What in the world could that mean? Well, I want to tell you about what that means, but I just did want to touch on one other thing. And last time we had a little bit of discussion and maybe some questions about whether or not seeds and potatoes and things like that can talk. I just want to tell you guys that actually there is some scientific evidence. Did you know that when a giraffe eats from a tree in a jungle in Africa, those trees, the trees, in order for them not to get completely devoured by the giraffe, they excrete off, they give off a little bit of a chemical in their leaves. And when a giraffe will eat a tree at the edge of the forest, that tree will give off a little bit of chemical because it knows it's being eaten. Its intelligence inside is saying, oh, I don't want to be completely eaten. So it starts to give off a little bit of a chemical. They have found that all the way, I don't know if it's miles, but distances apart, those trees begin to communicate to each other. And in the same forest, if that giraffe goes further down in, that first tree will send a message to the rest of the trees, and that giraffe won't be able to eat the rest of the trees because the whole forest is communicating to each other. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that crazy? I just wanted to point that out because I think it's pretty cool, the way that God put intelligence and the way that there's actually life inside. There's life inside of each of you, right? There's life inside of me. All right, well, let's find out what happens to Ceedie. So just to recap, the kind of soil that some of the other seeds were planted in was rocky and brown. It looked like that, right? Can you see that? It was rocky and brown. Remember Pat the potato? Especially Pat the potato. He was in some rocky brown soil. Can you guys see that? It was not rich and fertile. Now, that soil doesn't even look too bad. It's actually, it's actually got some fine looseness in it. but there's some rocks in it, and it's brown. I'm going to tell you a secret about soil. Grandma Jenkins knew this secret, and she knew that if you plant something in rich, fertile soil that's black, check that out. This is the kind of soil that Seedy was planted in. And see if you can smell it. If you get real close, you can smell that soil. There is something very different. Here, I'll pass it back here. I'll tell you what, I'll leave it in the back afterwards, and if you guys didn't get a good smell of it, you can smell it later. You see it? See how black that is? Can you see the difference between that? See that? Whoop. All right, I'll leave it in the back then later. You guys can smell it later, okay? I just want to show you that the soil that Seedy was planted in was rich and fertile. It was soft, and it was black. Now, when you're in black soil and you're face down and you can't see anything, do you think that's a fun day? Well, that's exactly how Seedy felt. He did not think it was a very fun day. In fact, he thought it was. You guys can sit back down. You want to sit back down, please? Isaiah, can you sit down again? Thank you. Well, Seedy was buried in that soil, and he felt like nothing in the world mattered. He completely dissolved into the ground. He actually lost all hope. He got to the place where he felt like life is not even worth living anymore. Not only was he lost, alone, and forsaken before, but now he was under the soil, and the one who he thought might actually finally care about him, Grandma Jenkins, had buried him in the ground and had walked over top of him. And he was not only sad and hurting in his heart, but he eventually got to the point where he thought, I guess I'll just be like this the rest of my life. And so he gave up hope. And you know what happened? He dissolved into nothingness. What seemed like him to nothingness. He didn't know where he was. You remember, he didn't know who he was. He didn't know if he was a boy or a girl. He didn't remember. He almost forgot everything that had ever happened to him. He almost didn't even care about being lost and alone anymore. He just dissolved, and it was dark and black. He cried. One night he cried himself to sleep. He didn't know this, but it was raining. Up top, it was raining. He felt the rain, and he couldn't even tell anymore if it was his own tears or if it was the rain coming down from outside. He couldn't even tell. He didn't know. And you know what? He got to the point where he almost didn't even care. But there was someone who did care. And every morning, she would pace back and forth across that area where she had planted the seed. Grandma Jenkins would speak some life into him. And she would say, "Oh, Seedy, you are such a special seed. Someday we're going to find out who you are and the amazingness and the beauty that's inside of you." And she would do this every morning. And I once heard about a charismatic preacher who actually did that to his plants. And you know, he would lay his hands on the plants after they started coming up, and he would speak life into them. And he said he got some of the biggest, best tomatoes and cucumbers and all kinds of plants that you can imagine. Do you know well, that's a whole other topic. We're not getting into that. But anyway, Seedy was down under there. Now, the thing about Seedy is he had gotten so lost, so alone and forsaken, he could no longer hear. Like I said, he dissolved into, he didn't know what. And one morning, sun came up. Days went by. Next morning, sun came up. Sun went down. Next morning, sun came up, sun went down. Hours went by, hours passed, days passed. Even a little bit more than a week passed. But every day, Grandma Jenkins would go out there and she would faithfully pour water on the plant. If it hadn't rained, the sun would beat down and keep the place warm. Seedy didn't know what was happening, and he actually disappeared into, he didn't know where he was. He didn't know what was going on. But one day, a number of days later, a crack began to happen in his shell. And again, kind of like the tears that were coming down his face, he couldn't tell if the crack was coming from himself or if he was so broken that he was now part of the earth. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know why this was happening to him. And he felt pain, deep pain in the deepest part of his heart. But all of a sudden, he began to crack open. And a very tiny sprout began to blossom out of seed and began to push up through the ground, up through the dirt, through the soft, fertile dirt. And it began to go up and up. And pretty soon, there was a plant about that tall. And then it got about that tall. And then about that tall. And Seedy became so different that you would not even recognize him. His shell had cracked open. You could not even tell anymore that he was a Seedy. Because now he had turned into a plant. And he breathed in the fresh air for the first time. What he felt like was the first time in his life. He started to look out and he realized that he was planted up on a high hill and he could see down over the valley farther than he had ever seen before in his life. He or she or it was not even Seedy anymore. So I don't even know what to call him. But I can tell you this. Grandma Jenkins knew what to call him. She was an expert on plants. And from very little up, she realized this is a very, very special. It looks like an apple. I think it's an apple tree. And she said, I think it's a scrub apple. And she started dancing. She jumped up and down. She said, I've always wanted an apple tree on my property. And she was so excited. She kept speaking life into that tree, and she kept watching as the sun would shine down. But you remember how Pat the potato and Cornelius the cornstalk and Paul the pea, remember how their owners, the guys that, the farmers that bought them would either spray them or try to force them to become more and become something? Do you remember that? Well, Seedy was different. Seedy's owner, Grandma Jenkins, she would just watch what was happening. Maybe she would give it some water and she would speak life over it, but she didn't touch the plant. She didn't pull the leaves off and try to stretch them so they would grow more. She didn't pull the branches up. She didn't grab it by the top and squeeze it up. No. She would just watch in awe as the scrub apple began to grow. And Seedy began to get larger and larger and larger. And scrub apples don't get huge, enormously tall. They get pretty high. If you've ever been down south, you can see how tall they get, or maybe even somewhere around here. But a scrub apple, Seedy the scrub apple began to grow larger and larger and larger, and he began to become beautiful. So beautiful from all the life that was poured into him and the soil that kept him all this time, that after a while, after a couple years, he began to grow some really, really nice fruit. And this is not a scrub apple, but this is an apple, you can see, and it looks very similar maybe to a scrub apple. Scrub apples, I think the apples are a little bit smaller, but this is similar enough that you guys can get the picture. Well, Seedy began to discover that he or she was very special. And like I said, Seedy had dissolved into something else, so I can't even hardly call it Seedy anymore. But the scrub apple, who actually Grandma Jenkins, she called him Sarah, or called her Sarah. And the reason she called her Sarah, I didn't tell you, this was a while back, but when we talked about the blood covenant, do you remember how people back in the days, many years ago, would sometimes make a covenant with each other and they would exchange different things? Well, there was also an exchange of names that would happen. If you are close friends with somebody, your mom and dad, when they get married, your mom takes on your dad's last name. Sarah is a name that from someone in the Bible. Does anybody know about Sarah in the Bible? Well, Sarah in the Bible, she was named, Sarai. Her name used to be Sarai. And then somebody took her name Sarai and added Sarah to it. Do you know why they put Sarah to her name? Do you know that back in the day, Yahweh was the Jewish name for God? They took the AH of Yahweh, and they did the same with Abraham because there was a covenant made with Abraham and Sarah. Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. So there's a little bit of Sarah's name in there and a little bit of God's name, and they were put together. Isn't that crazy? Did you know that's what happened to scrub apple, to little Seedy? Seedy starts with an S, right? Well, Grandma Jenkins, she thought Sarah would be a good name for him or her because now he was so big and he had become a tree. And scrub apple tree began to grow big and beautiful, and his fruit began to get gorgeous and sweet. And did you know that people came from all over the world to taste scrub apple's fruit, Sarah the scrub apple's fruit? Now his fruit, her fruit, began to just grow, and her apples became bigger than any other apples known across the whole world. So people and children especially would come from far and wide, and they would gather under the scrub apple, and they would pluck the apples from the tree and enjoy them for a snack. Not only a snack, but they would take bushels of them home with them. And after a bit, some of the seeds from the scrub apple would get planted and create an orchard, a whole orchard full of apples. Now, there was one question that Seedy continued to ask his whole life, and that was, how do I know that I'm special? How do I know that there's something special about me? Because you remember when he was a seed, he was so lost and so alone and so forsaken that he had forgotten who he was. And he felt like he desperately needed something, an affirmation or a confirmation. So even when he was still big, he was already a big scrub apple, and there were children coming from all over the world to enjoy his snacks and gather under his leaves and eat from his fruit. He still had that nagging question, how do I know that I'm special? How do I know that there's something in me that is unique and special? And you know what? One day there was a big storm that came along, a big thunderstorm, and a couple of his apples fell down and broke to the ground. Some of the apples that weren't quite ripe yet. And one of his apples cracked open, and you know what he saw inside? A star. Seedy looked down at the broken apples, and he couldn't believe it. He thought this whole time, somewhere out there was his specialness. If he just grew a little taller or a little bigger or a little stronger, he would be special. But he looked down, and there, inside his very own heart, was the beauty of a star. And do you know what's inside there? Do you know what that part of the apple is? Seeds. There was more inside of Seedy. His inside was bigger than his outside. And he realized that he would never stop growing, not with what's in there. It would continue to grow and reproduce and make more apples. And as long as the soil was ripe for those apples to grow, there would be the biggest, best orchard for children to come, not only from all over the world, but, well, maybe from other planets. I don't know, maybe not quite. But I want to tell you guys something. Do you guys remember the story? Do you remember the story of Uncle George and the blender? Do you remember what it was that he ate that gave him energy? An apple. Do you know where that apple came from? From Sarah the scrub apple. That's right. Isn't that cool? It's amazing how one little seed can turn into mass amounts of energy and life that we can't even fathom. Thank you guys for paying attention. That's the end of today's story. You guys can go back to your parents.